Hi everyone, I'm Janice and welcome to our podcast series on tidying up HACCP with Rolf Ace. Rolf is well known in the food industry and has travelled extensively and has audited thousands of HACCP studies. In our first episode of this series, we look at the application of the HACCP principles, some of the struggles and where things can go wrong and how to fix them. Hi Rolf and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us and we're really looking forward to hearing all about your experience with HACCP. So let's get started.
Hi Janice from Intercom Quebec, formerly known as Intercom PE. Yeah, nice to speak to you.
So Rolf, you've been auditing HACCP systems for years now and you've seen it all. From my experience, food companies are already afraid of HACCP, and when you mention the HACCP word, you already see them breathing faster. They're really going to hyperventilation, going to a panic mode, and sometimes they just completely disappear as well. What is your experience? Why do you think people are afraid of HACCP?
Yes, and I've heard all the nicknames for HACCP as well, like have a cup of coffee, please, and have a cold castle, please. So yeah, it is quite intimidating. But the thing is, it isn't HACCP that one should be afraid of. It's the food safety, and way back, and this all started way back in the 1990s when HACCP was a thing in South Africa, and it gained a bad reputation because it was associated with extra work, extra costs, infrastructure costs, extra training costs, and so on. That created a bit of a bad name. But it's not the HACCP that's the problem. That's only a small part of food safety. It's really the food safety. Food safety isn't designed to make your life more difficult. It shouldn't be an expense and a cost. It's there to reduce risk. So it's an insurance policy firstly, and secondly, it helps you be more organized. So you'll make less waste, and you'll be do things right the first time, and you'll be more productive.
Why is it that we still get it wrong, and why do we still struggle with this?
I would say it's distancing the theory from the practical. Typically, HACCP will be done by a few junior food technologists, typically, and they would sit in the office and they'll think up theoretical hazards. But the answers lie with that person that's been on the line for 30 years, the engineer who disassembles things and sees the mold build up in the equipment. That's the type of things we must take into account. And also the other problem is the auditors don't look in depth enough, and they just also tend to theoretically audit HACCP systems and give their 2 cents worth. And then in the whole process, all the real risks are missed.
We've got to make it real. And before we dive into these HACCP principles, there's also a lot of work that has to be done, preliminary work. We can't just dive in and expect to get HACCP, even though our HACCP certification is a matter of urgency and we wish we could just get this audit over with. What is it that we have to do, Rolf, to get ourselves ready before we start applying these HACCP principles?
Yes, if you look at the major food safety incidences of late, it's not been the HACCP that wasn't done right. It was prerequisites that failed. So you can take the examples. There was salmonella in baby infant formula. Root cause poor cleaning. They didn't clean their brushes. Polony had listeria in. Root cause not cleaning the cleaning baths. Up here on the West Coast where I'm from, there was a company who had to recall 82 million rands of canned product, and the root cause there was poor maintenance. They were just running too hard without stopping and doing maintenance. So yes, if you don't look after your prerequisites, then the dice is loaded from the start, and you won't get food safety right. So one needs all those things fixed, organized, procedurized, trained, and that takes a bit of time, unfortunately. And then from there on, one can now start doing your risk assessments and so on.
So you're looking at least 3 months for PRPs, assuming that you don't have any building issues. So once you've got those records mature and working, then from there you need to implement the HACCP section, and you also need to have 3 months history of those records working. So you're looking at least 6 months, considering that the building and the structures are all in place and correctly implemented.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But each site will be totally
Yeah.
different. But yeah.
Okay.
But
So,
rather do it properly, take your time, do it properly than to rush it just for the certificate.
all right. So assuming they've done it, we've got all the preliminary work and our PRPs are working for us. Now we apply the first HACCP principle, which actually starts with conducting a hazard analysis. And this seems pretty straightforward, but when you look at the ISO 22000 standard and what's involved, it looks like quite a lot more than just conducting a hazard analysis. In fact, it talks about identifying your hazards, then looking at your control measures for those hazards, and then categorizing the PRPs or control measures as well. So can you maybe talk to us about this? Because this seems pretty complicated to me.
All right. So how I would tackle this step by step is firstly keep the end goal in sight. So what are we trying to make? So make a proper finished product specification. And in there, one will say your microchemical physical hazards, things like water activity, pH, things that could affect food safety. And that's all now written down. And then you start on the other end, which is the raw material specifications, and you assess that. Then you do two risk assessments. One is a raw material risk assessment, where you take each raw material and you look at the risks in each raw material. And then you do a flow diagram where you draw a flow diagram of the process. And then at each stage, you look, what are my hazards at each stage, chemical, physical, micro, and allergens. And then you look at your control measures and those type of things.
The categorization of the control measures, can you talk to us about these three categories and how do we go about categorizing them? I know we're going to dive into this in the next podcast in more detail, but just give us just an overview.
Right. So in the 1970s, when HACCP was born, there was just you choose CCPs and that's it. There's no other option. And then with the GFSI in 2000 and the ISO 22000, 2005, sort of in the early 2000s, came the whole term of OPRP. And that gave us now an extra option, so there's three essentially categories, and that's the PRPs, OPRPs, CCPs. And in layman's terms, one shouldn't overcomplicate. The one needs extra special critical attention. The one is general attention. The other one is in between. But yeah, in the next podcast, I'll give the proper rundown, and I'll talk about a guidance document that's been issued by FSSC that really helps us understand each one of them and to not overcomplicate it.
That's great. So yeah, we're matching the control measure with the significance of the hazard. So it's almost like a fly swatter for a fly, a catty for something that's more irritating, a bigger pest, and then a cannon for something that's significantly more a threat, right, in terms of a hazard. So those like the three types of categories that we can look at in the next podcast. Is that right? Something like
Yes,
that?
and then a shotgun for us who have daughters.
So Rolf, when it comes to the application of this principle, what mistakes have you seen and how do you think we can go about fixing them?
Surprisingly enough, a mistake I see all the time is a company completely forgetting about the raw material hazard analysis. Now, if you're making a cookie product and you've got 5 ingredients, then you can build those 5 ingredients into the process flow and you can address each one and then it's fine. But I've seen, flavor companies with 500 raw materials or complicated processes, and then they just say, step 1 is receiving and all raw materials have exactly the same hazard. Now, one can't do that. You need to look at each raw material, what's the hazard with each raw material. Yes, sometimes you can combine. If let's say back to the flavor company, you can, all the oleo resins with the same pH and the same water activity, you can maybe combine together, etc., etc. All the ground spices and so on, so it's but the point is, don't forget about the raw material hazard analysis. And then the other mistake, just theoretical hazards versus real hazards and not understanding the process. And that gets into, you need to understand the engineering of equipment, what can go really wrong inside the equipment, and that's often missed. And one of the principles also is to look at or the steps in the HACCP process is to verify your flow diagram and make sure you got the right step. But when doing that, just also look at whether you got the right hazards. Now, if you're at the conveyor belt and you're looking at the risks there, look up and see, okay, flaking paint is a hazard. Look on the conveyor, okay, strings from the conveyor is a risk, and real risks that are not theoretical, and speak to the seasoned experts that know where things go wrong and include that in the hazard analysis.
Okay, and then another mistake that I've noticed, and I don't know if it's something you've also seen, Rolf, is that people are quite vague when they describe their hazards and the source of their hazard. And if they don't get that right, then the control measure is also vague, and that doesn't really achieve anything either. Have you found this as well?
Yes, I found the same. And yes, especially the control measures such as good manufacturing practices or supply quality assurance. Now, the sign of a good hazard plan is when there's a reference to, okay, this is my hazard, specific, where exactly, what type of hazard, and then a control measure showing a reference.
So, Rolf, give us the key points. What can we take away?
First takeaway, don't be intimidated. HACCP and food safety is there because it makes good business sense. It's an insurance policy, and it makes you do things right the first time. You're more organized. So it's not something to be intimidated and scared of. Don't distance theory from practical. Understand the equipment, understand your process, and come up with real hazards. Don't be afraid to speak to experts, speak to people who have been there. Then the importance of PRPs. If that goes wrong, then HACCP will be a challenge. And then good specifications, because that's your starting point with your prep work. And then, don't forget about the raw material and the process hazard.
Thanks, Rolf. That was really great. And we look forward to the next podcast where we can discuss the application of the second HACCP principle with you. Mail us at info@intercom.co.za to subscribe to our podcasts, videocasts, and ebooks, where we can give you loads of free information to help you with your food safety systems.